Well, hey, howdy everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to So What, the Marketing Analytics and Insights live show. I'm Katie, joined as always by Chris and John, who I can lift up today. We're never quite in the same configuration, so when you guys are like the two top boxes, it's a little easier than me trying to figure out left from right. Um Happy New Year, guys. Welcome back. We
Happy
haven't
New
done this
Year.
in a while.
Oh, so glad the holidays are over.
Our chief statistician John is also our chief grumpy pants.
Chief Grinch.
So we're gonna get right back into it. As expected, we're talking about generative AI. Specifically, we're talking about generative AI in 2024, and we're doing today's episode Ask Me Anything style. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the comments, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. We do have a bunch of questions already that we're going to try to get to because that's the topic du jour. Generative AI. What do I need to do? How do I use it? What does it mean for me? So we're going to try to answer some of those questions today. And this, I suspect, guys, will become something we do quite often on this show. So let's just start at the top. Is it possible, Chris, to sort of summarize what's new in generative AI? Let's just say like in the past 10 days.
10 days.
10 days.
A bunch of things have happened. And let's scope it to just before the holidays as well. The big one from a regulatory perspective was the EU Parliament passing the EU AI Act, which is, and we've talked about this in the past, the EU tends to be the leader in the world of regulation on major technology and stuff, especially when it comes to individual rights. If for those who may or may not remember, back in the last decade, the EU was one of the planetary leaders on data privacy, culminating in 2018 with an act called GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which became sort of the gold standard planet-wide for how to protect data. And many other legislative acts, California's CCPA and CPRA, followed in the footprints left behind by GDPR. And so many of the other privacy legislation that exists in the world is a derivative of that in some fashion. If you comply with GDPR, you're pretty much compliant with all of the other, follow-on acts, if you will. Well, the EU AI Act appears to be going the same general route, and that means that because it's setting the tone for and about the ways AI should be used, it's likely to be the sort of the gold standard for it, and then other places in legislation will probably follow in its footsteps. There's an entire module in the Trust Insights course, the Generative AI for Marketers course, which you can get at trustinsights.ai/AI course. I believe it's chapter 6. That goes through all the six major provisions of the EU AI Act. The one that is really important, well, this we call it the 5D process, right? Which is number one is deter, don't use prohibited cases of AI. So there's a whole bunch of things that EU AI Act lists, like, don't do this with AI. It's all the things you'd expect. There is defend the rights of individual users. There is document, which is document the use of AI. There's disclosing the use of AI. I can't remember what the fifth one is why it's in the course. The big one that affects most marketers is document and disclose. The EU AI Act makes disclosure of the use of AI mandatory. We've been saying last 2 years, you really should be disclosing the use of AI. It helps reinforce copyright and so on and so forth. And now with this new legislative act, it's not optional anymore. So if we were to put up the new theme music for this show, we would have to disclose generated by AI if we want to be compliant with the EU AI Act. If you put up a blog post image on your blog and it's a dog on a skateboard wearing a tutu, you need to have some disclosure saying made by AI, so that you're compliant with the law. That's one of the really big developments. The other two things that have come out that I think are really interesting. One is, in December, we saw Mistral, the French company, release a new model called Mixtral, which is a mixture of experts model. And if you think about a tool like Chat GPT and the GPT-4 model. That's like having an expert chef in your kitchen, right? It's like having Gordon Ramsay living in your kitchen, complete with all the swearing. Mixtral is kind of like having maybe a slightly lesser chef and like 7 sous chefs all in the kitchen at the same time. So they're not as good as a single Gordon Ramsay talent-wise, but they are a lot more productive because you can have that many more people simultaneously working on things. So mixture of experts is this new model architecture. I mean, it's not new, it's from 1991, but the implementation is new, and that is it is proving to be best in class for open models that you can download and run on your laptop. That's number 2. And then the third big thing is that we're starting to see really interesting multimodal use cases, things that cross a lot of really weird boundaries. Just today, speaking of newness, just today, Meta released an audio to video generation model that is just mind-boggling. You give it sampled audio, like the conversation we're having right now, and it renders 3D avatars that are photorealistic of synthetic people having that conversation. So Katie, if you and I were recording just an audio podcast, or if John and I wanted to resurrect like old episodes of Marketing Over Coffee, this would create 3D realistic synthetic people having that conversation. So we could like get some sampled video of us sitting in a coffee shop and recreate the first 800 episodes of Marketing Over Coffee. So that's multimodality in ways that is absolutely crazy, where you take audio, turning it into text, and then use that text to feed 3 different video models to create this synthetic stuff. So it's just in the last 10 days, that's what's been happening.
Well, that's a lot. And I think that, what we've seen so far is that the technology is changing so quickly. I totally think that you should absolutely take that number 3 point and do that with old episodes of Marketing Over Coffee to, and I mean it in all seriousness, because one of the things we know is that content is king. Let's just say, like, people love that phrase, content is king. Content is what people consume. That's how they learn about you. It's how they engage with you. And I think that Marketing Over Coffee would be a really good opportunity, because you have so much content and you have so much high quality content, to really experiment with some of these tools and demonstrate the capabilities, while also repurposing your content maybe to a whole new audience. So, thank you for that summary, Chris. One of the questions that we have is, what are some use cases for operations using AI?
So before we get into that, I want to highlight one other use case that's come up actually in our Slack group. If you go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, you can join our Slack group there. It's free to join. Was someone saying recently, hey, I love Marketing Over Coffee. I would love to share it with our team, but they only speak Portuguese. What's the likelihood that we can get Marketing Over Coffee in Portuguese? And the answer used to be probably not soon. So again, this is an open source library released by Meta. It's called Seamless Communications. Seamless M4T is the name of the model. I will give you the upfront caveat. Getting this thing to work is a pain in the ass. It requires extensive technical knowledge and a willingness to roll up your sleeves and compile code, install libraries, all that fun stuff. But if you do it, and you're willing to endure the pain of doing it or setting up the environment for it, what it does is pretty cool. You give it audio in one language, and it translates the audio into another language. So you could have Marketing Over Coffee in Portuguese, or in-ear insights in Ukrainian, or any of the, I think it's like 73 different supported languages. When we talk about marketing and even marketing operations, just having your content available to other markets is pretty cool, especially if it does not require additional work from you as the human, right? So translation and translation technologies like this are pretty incredible. Now, I will also say Seamless M4T is buggy as hell. I've been playing with it extensively, and it's got a little ways to go. But there have been some other new tools. Unity AI is another package that exists that can do voice cloning. Again, running on your desktop. So I think from a marketing operations perspective, being able to take stuff that you've already built and putting it into many more different formats is huge.
I would agree with that. I think, we often talk about the video transmedia framework where you're basically starting with one piece of content, maybe it's recorded video, and then you are pulling it apart to repurpose it. So you're doing the work once and then getting a lot out of it. This almost feels like the opposite process where you're starting with something small, like maybe an audio clip, maybe even a blog post, and using generative AI to create a video file, create an audio file, translate it into multiple languages. Because, Lord knows we can't wait for John to finish learning Portuguese.
That's a blind spot on my part there. Not picking up any language. Testing has proven that that's a futile exercise.
What do you think, John, about, so I mean, we're using marketing over coffee as the example. Is this the kind of thing that you would be interested in using generative AI for?
Yeah, the translation thing is really interesting. I mean, for marketing over coffee, but I just think in general, I think there's going to be some major societal shifts when people can just speak every language. We're very close to just real-time translation on a phone, when you go around. So yeah, that's amazing. That's fantastic. The meta thing that Chris was talking about where, you just give it an audio file and it creates, fresh content. That's really interesting as far as in content production for movies and TV and stories and things like that. I mean, imagine they basically get a star to train the model once and then that's it. You just feed it the scripts and the shows come out the other end. I mean, that's kind of insane to think about. In fact, I did notice they had David Schwimmer as one of the audio files in there just to drive that point home for anybody that didn't see that coming stealth. Yeah, the only other thing that has hit me recently, though, is, content is king has always been the mantra, but I've heard a lot of people with the dawn of AI going with, well, unique content is king.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have something that's at least better than the average stuff out there, or you're going to be one of a million of the same thing out there.
I feel like that sentiment has always been true. It's just never been outwardly stated.
Yeah.
You have to have good, high quality, unique content in order for it to stand out. But now with generative AI, and we'll get into some of the SEO and search questions, it's even more important to have really good, high quality content. Otherwise, I think what's the term, Chris? The sameness of it all starts to happen, because if you're using generative AI to create your content, it's going to look the same as everyone else because everyone's using the same training models.
And that's a really important point, because part of what will make you successful using generative AI for content creation in particular, which is one of marketing's big use cases, is leveraging your own data. Something that came up in this week's Inbox Insights, the Trust Insights newsletter, which you can get at trustinsights.ai/newsletter. We talked about data is one of the differentiators for how your generative AI efforts will differ from others. So a couple of really simple examples. One, if you are willing to invest the time and spend a whole lot of time digging around in the models themselves, you can get them to approximate writing style really well. Now, writing style is one of those things that is very challenging because of imprecision in language. So the reason why AI doesn't work as well as we would expect it to is because our language is shockingly imprecise, even though we use it to communicate every single day. If I say he was wearing a red dress, there's so little information in there about the specifics to visualize that it requires additional content to create a context. With generative AI, style is one of those things you can't describe because it is so ambiguous, and it's so difficult to say, and there's so many components of it. There's word selection, vocabulary, sentence structure, pacing, grammar, etc., etc. What you can do is feed either examples to a machine to have replicate a certain type of writing style, or do what's called priming, where you take we do this with our synthetic version of Katie GPT. I've taken probably close to 100,000 words of stuff that Katie's written, and then asked a language model on each of the 22 aspects of writing style, describe Katie's writing style for this, and then taken that feedback passed it back through a model, and said, now summarize each of these things into the specific keywords to create a priming representation. That allows me to have a very, very complex system prompt that's behind the scenes in KDGPT. So that when you talk to it, it is going to sound more like Katie than just something you can do with prompts alone. That has to come from your data. You have to have the data, and it has to be in good condition, and you have to have the techniques to do that, to be able to create those priming representations and those few shot learning examples to generate really good output. But when you do, it's a lot more unique. Right? It is not the same as lame, as our friend Jay Bear likes to say. Same as lame. Yeah, if you were just saying, hey, write me a blog post about B2B marketing influencers, yeah, you're gonna get the same as lame stuff. If you spend the time to codify your writing style, and then you add in unique content that you have, maybe about B2B marketing influencers, then when you ask the machine to create stuff drawing on your data, you're going to get stuff that is unique to you and that has never been done before.
Does John GPT exist yet?
Not yet.
If we want a podcasting flavored version of me, I guess, yeah, that would be the way to go.
No, and I think go ahead, Chris.
That's a really, really important point that John just made. Things like podcasts are super, super valuable sources of information. One of the things that I did with Katie GPT as part of that writing style development was to take, I think it was 80 episodes of In Your Insights, take the transcripts. I used some Python code that ChatGPT wrote to split the transcripts by speaker. So I took only Katie's stuff. The only things Katie said, put that in the knowledge base. With 800 episodes of Marketing Over Coffee, with John being on every single one of them, we can take all 800 transcripts, split them up, and say, this is the language of John GPT.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that, we've talked about this before, and this is my stance, is that new tech doesn't solve old problems. And so your point about needing to have really good data and data quality it's always been important, but now where generative AI is so much in the forefront of what everyone's trying to do, having really good data quality, data governance is vitally important in order for these systems to work correctly. If you have a CRM system, depending on the size of your company, you can kind of go through and fix things as you see the errors. With a system like ChatGPT or any sort of generative AI system, it's harder to do that because the models, unless you're someone like Chris, are a bit of a black box to you. You can't really go in and tweak it. You have to know that the data that you're putting in is really to good quality. And that's something, just to put a little bit of a plug, that we can help with. We really have a lot of deep knowledge and expertise on data quality and data governance to help you get to that point where the data that you have is really good and you can feel confident putting it into your generative AI model. Okay, so another question. This is sort of a big question, but what is the best way to integrate different software systems with AI? And I feel like there's going to be a number one, it depends. Number two, what does that mean for you? And there's probably a number three that I'm not thinking of. So yeah, let's just start with maybe even helping people think about how to answer that question for themselves. Maybe that's the way to approach it.
I'll say, what are you integrating? Here's the thing. A language model. If we're talking language models, actually, we can break it. So there's language models and image models and video models. So the three big, and audio models. Okay, so four big things: text, audio, video, image. All these things have APIs. All these things have inputs and outputs. And so the question you have to ask is, how does this appliance fit into the overall workflow, right? It's like having a blender. Where does the blender fit into the workflow? If you're making margaritas, it's pretty important. If you're making steak, you're not going to use the blender, not if you're sane. And so the first part you have to figure out is, and this is unsurprisingly going to mirror the Trust Instance 5P framework. What are you trying to do? What's the purpose? Who's involved? What are the existing processes? And then when you're talking about the integration of generative AI, it is, what platforms will you be connecting, and how will you be connecting them? Again, these things just have APIs. They're like any other piece of software. So if you've used tools like Zapier or If This Then That or whatever, you know kind of how APIs work. It's like connecting Lego blocks together. The language model is going to be used for language purposes in this flow, and then ultimately you have some kind of outcome that you measure by your performance. The one big warning for everyone to remember is that language models are good at language. Language models are not good at things that are not language. And so people trying to use ChatGPT for everything or DALL-E for everything, it's just going to give you a bad result because that's not what it's good at. It's good at language. It's not good at things that are not language. So if you're trying to have it do regression analysis for attribution modeling, as a marketing example, it's not going to do well with that. It can write the code in Python that will do the attribution modeling, but can do the math. And in fact, if you've used ChatGPT's advanced data analysis, that's what it's doing behind the scenes. Is it's just writing code, and then the code is executing and it's looking at the outputs. So my caution there is when you're talking about integrating different systems with AI, what are the language tasks that you're trying to do if you're using language models? And then are you connecting those things together? If you're doing image tasks, are you where does that image fit into your workflow? And you've got to have your people and processes and your purpose documented out before you do the integrations.
You talked about how the advanced models are doing it. They're writing the code. This is shout out to Andy Crestodina. One of the things that he showed when I saw him speaking at Content Marketing World was you can ask these systems like generative AI to show your work or show me the code that you've written. And it's like, okay, here's the code I've written. Even if that's not part of what you're trying to accomplish, so that, again, if you have someone like a Chris Penn on your team, you can say, here's the code for all of this. Is there a way that we can then now put this together for our own script so that we can run this without having to bring it to generative AI? I just thought that that was such a really interesting pro tip, is that you can ask it to show its work and it will. And then if you understand how to read code, you can say, oh, that's not what I wanted it to do at all. Let me fix that. And that takes a bit of that mystery out of what is generative AI doing when I'm asking it to do something.
In fact, not only can you have it show its work, you can have it give you the actual code, right? So this is something I was working on earlier today. Katie, one of the things Katie asked for help with this year was getting more data out of HubSpot. We have HubSpot. We have data in it. We know what we've done to set this thing up, but we also know that HubSpot's integrations, they have a robust Python package to connect to their API. That's not a language I code in very well, but ChatGPT sure does. So I know what to ask it for. I say, okay, let's write the code to get all the data out of HubSpot so that we can do the work that we need to do to build an attribution model. This is language. This is a task that a language model is really good at. So when we're talking about integrating generative AI into different systems, questions we have to ask, do the existing systems have APIs? If they do, great. Guess what? Now you have a way for generative AI to talk to it. Does the downstream output have some kind of API? In this case, one of the things that we use a lot is we use Google's BigQuery because we want to be able to look at stuff in Data Studio. And so once this is done, it's going to write its data to BigQuery so that Katie can look at all the things she wants to look at in Data Studio without needing to code. So that's an example of this integration. But the first thing she had to do was she actually had to sit down. We had to sit down together and write out user stories for what this thing was supposed to be doing.
I think we wrote probably a couple of dozen user stories, and we found the similarities between them once we wrote them, but we really needed to spend some time doing those requirements up front because, Chris, you're reviewing all of these things sort of at a very quick pace and at a high level, but the amount of time that actually goes into writing this code, working with these APIs, doing this integration, it's a multi-day, multi-week, multi-month process. And 10 times out of 10, there's going to be errors the first time around. So you have to go back, you have to trouble. It's software development, essentially. And that there's nothing speedy about good software development.
That's true. By the way, pro tip, if you're doing development with ChatGPT, One of the easiest things you can do to keep it and you on the rails is to have your requirements written out, preferably in like a bullet point checklist, and that gets pasted at the end of your code. You can see here my requirements for this code are in the code itself as a big comment. When ChatGPT processes the code, each time you are refreshing its memory as to what the requirements are, and it generally develops much more coherent outputs if you do that.
When Chris Penn starts championing requirements and requirements documentation, I know that I've done my job correctly.
So you need to have a sword you can like tap him as Sir Christopher now.
That's right. The champion of business requirements.
Well, it's a language model. And requirements are language. And so if you want it to generate good language, you need to provide it with good language. And there's no better language for keeping an AI on the rails than requirements.
It's funny how the same could be said about humans.
Now, because humans can ignore stuff, machines are you can compel machines to pay much more close attention.
Well, we're not going to get into this debate today, but I feel like that is something that we'll cover in the podcast at some point. All right. So here's an interesting question. So there's been a lot of chatter about SEO and search engines and how is generative AI changing? So one of the questions that we got was how do search engines deal with AI hallucinations now and in the future? So before we get into that, Chris, can you define what an AI hallucination is?
This is a very complicated question to answer because it depends on the model. So
let's say it's ChatGPT, which is the one that most people are using.
So this is a very, very complicated question to answer.
I thought it was simplifying it, but perhaps not.
No. When you build, when a company like OpenAI or Google or whoever builds one of these models, what they are doing, to put it in the simplest possible terms, is that's mathematically incorrect. So if you know vectors and embeddings and stuff like that, this is completely wrong, but this is conceptually correct. They're basically just building really big word clouds. And every word that they scan has a word cloud around it. And what a model is a giant series of word clouds. That's conceptually what's going on. When you prompt a foundation model, which is the basic raw model compiled from trillions of pages of text, it is essentially looking at how the different word clouds intersect and overlap. And what it produces is the statistically most relevant representation of the words that belong together, right? Words and phrases and stuff. The Transformers architecture is just looking at contextually which words belong next to each other. So it can assemble these. It's actually assembling tokens, but that's another topic for another time. A pure foundation model generates what are called hallucinations, which are statistically relevant but factually incorrect associations. Foundation models generate hallucinations 100% of the time. When you look at a raw model, what's coming out of it, it is coming out with just complete hallucinations all the time because it's all mathematics. It's all, this word belongs next to this word because it's seen frequently. When you get to an instruct model, which is like what the first version of ChatGPT was before it was open to the public, called Instruct GPT. This is a model that has been tuned. It's called supervised fine tuning, where a company like OpenAI gives it hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of examples. What is the color of the sky? Blue. Who is the president of the United States in 1996? Bill Clinton, and so on and so forth. And it's just gazillions of these things. And it essentially tells the model, I want you to change the associations between all these words and phrases and sentences to match the inputs and the outputs. It's called supervised fine tuning. At that point, you're starting to reduce hallucination rates because now you're saying, hey, like something like who's president of the United States in 2001? George W. Bush, right? That it's not George H.W. Bush, it's George W. Bush, and so on and so forth. So it's conditioning the word associations to follow these paths. That's at the point where hallucination rates start to go down. Then the third step when you make these models is called reinforcement learning with human feedback. So as people use a tool like ChatGPT, it gets better over time because more and more it takes the inputs it gets from our usage of it. So if I'm writing Python code and I say, hey, check your work, I don't think you did this right, it knows that its previous response wasn't as good. And so it gets tuned and shaped along those lines. When we're talking about hallucinations, it depends on the level of model that we're using. Most people are going to use a service like ChatGPT or Google Bard, and the hallucination rate is reasonably low. It is almost never going to be zero, because what comes out of the foundation model itself is 100% hallucination. Like, these things are hallucination machines by design. And so it's this fine tuning that shapes the results. And awkwardly, the hallucinations are decreasing, but so is the utility, because the more rules you put on these models, the worse their outputs get in terms of quality. They get more sameness, less creativity, the more rules you put on. So, for example, if you talk to ChatGPT about a sensitive topic, right, or a political opinion, whatever, it will oftentimes just say, nope, I can't do that. Or if it does respond, it's very, very bland and boring. And again, that's that reinforcement learning human feedback's been tuning it to say, hey, you should respond in these certain ways, and it's not as creative.
Did you get that, John?
Remember that kid in junior high school that would just lie all the time to try and make friends? That's what's happening here. It's coming up with an answer that considers most probable and throws it out there, and it doesn't really matter if it's true or not.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, it's funny, to sort of continue along that thought process, John. I often say to my husband, like, he's all like, he never gives you a straight answer the first time, but he says it with such authority that you can never tell if he's kidding or not. And so he has his whole team believing certain things about him and his life because he says it with such authority that they don't think to question that it's not correct, including, his favorite bands and, who he was in a past life and, what his hobbies are. They're all lies. They're all complete fabrications. But he says it in such a way that you're like, oh, it must be true. And I feel like that's sort of along the lines, in a very, very simplistic way of what you're describing, Chris. Very simplistic.
And the challenge with language is language itself is extremely imprecise. So a part of that imprecision is why we we struggle sometimes with getting language models to do what we want. So I'll give you an example. Let's take the sentence. A friend of mine sent this to me the other day. I laughed hilariously. Let's take the sentence, I never said we should kill him, right? Based on that sentence, that's just text. But where you put the emphasis as a human changes the meaning. If I say, I never said we should kill him, I'm saying it's not my fault, right? If I said, I never said we should kill him, I said, you killed the wrong person. If I say, I never said we should kill him, I thought we were going to hire a hitman. That same string of text changes its meaning based on our spoken emphasis, which is not reflected in just the words themselves. And so we have this ambiguity. And so when we talk about hallucination, a good part of hallucination is because we're dealing with ambiguity in language. Language is inherently imprecise. That's one of the reasons why a tool like ChatGPT does so well with coding, because Python and other languages are precise language. It either runs or it doesn't run. And there's not a lot of ambiguity in the actual word assembly of the tokens. Whereas writing a blog post, there's a million different ways to talk about B2B marketing influencers. And if we don't provide a lot of specificity in our prompting, we're going to get ambiguous and or sometimes hallucinatory outputs.
That's a killer example. I love that because it plays totally differently with every reading.
It does. I mean, that's actually an exercise I've seen people do, like public speaking things. Mm-hmm. They'll take a sentence and say, now change the emphasis on each time you read the sentence on a different word and see how it changes the meaning. It's like, oh, even though like English is not a tonal language like Chinese, for example, that emphasis changes meaning and it's not reflected in text. So going back to your question, Katie, about how search engines deal with AI hallucinations, the number one way is they don't use models for knowledge, right? If you look at Microsoft Bing and its use of ChatGPT, the GPT-4 model, if you look at Perplexity AI, if you look at other tools like this, what they are doing is they are acting as a language interpreter. And if you can watch this, when you use Microsoft Bing with Copilot, you'll say, hey, what is a good recipe for guacamole? You will see it translate your text into Bing search queries, make those queries, get results from Bing search archive, and then aggregate and synthesize an answer. So very smartly, what Microsoft is doing is saying this language model is good at language, but we know it's bad at facts. So we're going to instead offload the fact part to our search engine. Bing comes back with some results. It synthesizes those results into language again that is conversational in nature. And you're like, oh, that's helpful. Compare that to Google Bard, which does try to use in the previous versions, it does try to use the knowledge of the model, and it comes up with hallucinations. In fact, so much so that they've actually put in a button that says, check Google's responses, and then it goes back and Googles the things it wrote and says, oh yeah, actually I lied, I completely made that up. And so that structure of going to a different source of truth is how search engines deal with that. That is contingent, obviously, on the search engine itself and how good its search engine results are, right? So if you ask a search engine for something that is scientifically questionable, it will give it to you, right? You ask Google, show me videos or show me text that proves the earth is flat. Like, Google will find that for you. It's wrong, but it is factually wrong. But there's a lot of content on the internet about that, and Google will surface that. And so this is one of the big challenges with AI and with search itself is just because a machine can find it doesn't mean it's true.
Mm-hmm. I think that one of my favorite descriptions of that is you have the entire solar system when every other planet is a sphere, and then the Earth is just a flat thing. It's like, how do you think this is a thing? But okay, let's go with it. So I don't want to. I think misinformation is its a whole topic that we can cover. But I think that that's a really important disclaimer, is that there's a lot of misinformation that's going to be spread even more quickly than we were, being able to sort of get our arms around it before. One of the questions, Chris, because we're sort of we've been talking about this for quite a bit. One of the questions that came up was why image generation prompts don't work as well as text generation prompts. And before you get into the weeds and the technical details, one of the things that you said to me the other day just totally blew my mind. We were recording the podcast, and you said something along the lines of generative AI can't see what it's showing you. And it was like, it was such a factual, simple statement, but it just blew my mind because it's a machine. It's numbers, it's code. It doesn't have eyeballs or a way to actually see. So if you say, this is a picture of a chicken, it's taking your word for it. It's saying, okay, this is a picture of a chicken. It can't look at that and be like, John, you're lying. That's a donkey. And that just totally blew my mind. So image generation prompts, why don't they work as well as text generation prompts?
Because they're different. There's two things. They're different mechanisms, right? So image generation is done with a technique called diffusion, whereas text generation is done with this process called transformers. They're similar mathematically under the hood, but they're not the same thing. And because of the way image generation models are trained, the prompting structure is going to be different. The general process for training an image diffusion model is to take a gazillion number of images and their associated captions or text or alt text or whatever, and create associations. So you would have, picture of Jimmy Carter, picture of Jimmy Carter at Camp David, and so on and so forth. Those captions from news sources, from image catalogs, Amazon, alt text for visually impaired, all that becomes this matrix of here's a word and here's what's associated with this type of image. And then when you prompt an image generation model, you give it words And then what it does is it takes sort of a mathematical average of all the images it knows to contain all these different words and try to meld them together and chips away at all the pixels until it gets something that reaches a mathematical average of the words that you've used. So if you had dog on, wearing a pink tutu, riding a skateboard, it's going to have sort of a mathematical understanding of those different concepts from all the things it's trained on, which is why in pure image generation systems, you have these really strangely worded prompts like picture of an envelope ejecting through the cockpit of an F-18 Super Hornet, photorealistic, highly realistic photo, 24 millimeter lens DSLR. Right? That's an image generation prompt. Makes very little sense to us as spoken word, but it's because we know we're taking advantage of captions and highlights and descriptions from museum walls that these image models were trained on. Because of that, if you don't know the syntax of how an image generation model works, you're going to get subpar results. Combine that with the fact that what is typically put into image generation models are very short snippets of text. Again, they're captions or alt text. They're not paragraphs of description. John, as an example, describe this.
That would be purple chicken with Santa hat and scarf.
Right, but you could spend a lot of time talking about this, right? Like this is clearly a holiday chicken. It's probably a plastic holiday chicken. It seems to light up. It's got a scarf. It's got a hat. There's a little bit of mistletoe on the hat. It's a painted piece of plastic. The chicken doesn't look super thrilled to be here. Right? There's so many different things you could say about this. What's the old adage from the classics, right? And a picture is worth 10,000 words. Right? You could easily. You shouldn't, but you could easily write 10,000 words about this thing. And yet an image model's been trained on maybe 20, right? And so when you don't get good performance out of an image model, it's because the words you're using don't occur in captions, in image captions is essentially what it boils down to. Now, there are services like Stable Diffusion, which are trying to help build libraries where machines can auto tag and create more enhanced captions on images they already have control over. But that's a long, complicated, and expensive process. And so the reason why image generation prompts don't work as well if you're just trying to use natural language is because the models were not trained that way. And the best models that are, in terms of easy use and performance, typically have very large data sets, but they still require a little bit of that tweaking. When you use the DALL-E function inside ChatGPT, what it's doing is very much what Bing is doing. It's taking your words, translating it to a DALL-E compatible prompt, and then pushing that into the system. And that's where our conversation point came from earlier, Katie, which is it's passing a prompt to DALL-E. It can't see what DALL-E is doing. It has no idea what DALL-E is doing. So it just gets the result back from the API. It says, here's your thing. Did you like it? And you're like, no. I had this problem with a client. I was doing a picture of 4 people in a car on a road trip, and it kept putting 5 people in the car. And I would keep saying, no, try again. You have 4 people in the car. There's 5 people in this car. Again, that's because of the caption data that was trained on. What I end up doing is saying, make a picture of 3 people on a road trip in a car. Surprise! I got a car with 4 people in it. I'm like, I don't know what is wrong with this training data set, but it's clearly got some problems counting.
I feel like creative directors around the world are rejoicing, saying, finally, people understand our pain when our clients say, I don't know, just make something pretty. Or I don't make it blue. Like, what does that mean? What shade of blue? What kind of blue? What is it about it that you want to be blue? And so it's what strikes me, and we've sort of talked about this quite a bunch as well, is that all of the struggles that people are having working with these generative AI systems are the exact same struggles that people have as managers, as communicators, as delegators. The difference here, and Chris, this is where you get excited, is that the machine doesn't talk back and say, I need to take a break and go get an iced coffee. The machine says, okay, what else do you want me to do?
Mm-hmm.
And it's very agreeable and it's very compliant, but you still have to know what it is that you're asking. And so for someone like me, seeing this just sort of play out, I'm like, Well, now all of the struggles that I've had trying to get people to document requirements, understand why they're important, think about specificity when you're delegating or, giving instruction. Like this is all coming to light. It's all surfacing of like, and this is why. And so now we can take all of these skills that we're learning working with generative AI systems and reapply that back to our teams. I'm like, oh, now I understand. If I'm clear in my instruction when I ask my team members to do something, they'll know what I'm asking and there won't be frustration on both sides to be like, well, you didn't tell me what you wanted. You just said fancy font. I don't know what fancy font means.
Yep. And I think that's a really good example. Plus, what just came in the comments as well, with a lot of these systems, we have to think about them, the way they work under the hood. And again, this is something actually going to be covering in an upcoming course in the Trust Insights Academy on advanced prompt engineering. But the way they work is by essentially selecting probabilities, right? Under the hood, they're selecting different probabilities. When you give it a task that is entirely self-contained, like make a one-page opt-in site, the number of probabilities that can be invoked for that are so many that the machine will not be able to complete the job. It's like saying, "Hey, drive from New York to San Diego." Like, just give me three sets of three bullet points on how to drive from New York to San Diego. Like, well, get in your car, start driving until you get there. Right? It's going to be unhelpful. If you say, "Give me turn by turn instructions on how to drive from New York to San Diego," you're going to get a much better result, right? The same is true of language models. It's a system called chain of thought, or well, there's a variety of different ways to describe it. But essentially, these models, when they're choosing probabilities, they need room to do so. They need to choose probabilities, then consider everything they've given you to choose new probabilities, and consider everything they've given you, and so on and so forth. It's recursive. It's the nature of the transformers architecture. And so when you say, instead of give me a one-page opt-in site, say, let's first talk through how would you do this, right? And have it write an outline, and then say, great, now let's talk about step 1, writing the HTML. Step 2, writing the body copy. Step 3, writing the things. And if you follow those steps, it will generate really good results. When I'm doing something like this code that we were working on earlier, I do not say we're going to write code to interface with HubSpot's API, because I will get nothing useful back. What I'll say is, first, outline the steps that you need. Now frame out just the function names and placeholders for the functionality, and it will write that. And then I will say, okay, great. Now let's write function insert to database, write that, and it does it. Okay, now let's write the safe int conversion function. Let's write that. And then you assemble the pieces because you're doing chain of thought, and you end up with very strong, coherent outputs. But you can't do it in one shot. It has to be done in multiple steps. To what you're saying, Katie, very much like working with a really smart intern. You can't say, hey, go make me a website. Like, no. You have to tell the intern step by step and work with the intern step by step to get the output that you want.
So as we're wrapping up, because we're just about at time, Chris, do you feel like working with generative AI systems is now going to change the way that you interact with human team members?
Yes, it makes me less tolerant of working with human team members, because I have to deal with all of their needs and stuff. And, it's like, I can't do that. And, I'm having a bad day. Like, no, I'm just going to work with the machines, because machines don't have bad days. I can work with them. I can give them exact requirements. I don't have to worry about hurting their feelings. I don't have to worry about, all the frailties of flesh and blood. To me, they are the perfect coworkers.
So let me rephrase. Do you think it has changed your approach in terms of giving instruction to a human team member?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, we were working with an intern last year, and I found myself in giving directions to the intern, just essentially writing prompts. Like, I wrote prompts for the human intern. Yeah.
John, any final thoughts?
No, I think that's a great place to wrap it up there. It's great for documentation. I think that's the right approach. And it is, this iterative approach is better. And we just have to deal with the human inconsistencies. That's just part of the mix, but that's okay.
there's a lot of questions that we didn't get to, so we'll definitely be doing more of these AMA style live streams over the next few weeks. The other thing I just want to note for those of you who have been watching the show is that Chris is a wealth of knowledge. We haven't yet been able to stump you on the details. And so if you're interested in bringing Chris into your organization or your agency, you can visit us at trustinsights.ai/AI services. And we have a lot of different options for you to be able to work with, the caliber of expertise, Chris, that you have on AI in general, but also more specifically on generative AI and the more deeply technical. We're focusing this year a lot on education. So of course we have our new generative AI course that launched at the end of last year. You can get that at trustinsights.ai/AI course if you want something that's more self-paced. But if you're looking to bring in that expertise in-house and have someone really talk to your team about generative AI, then I think that, bringing Chris in is a really good option.
I think that's a great place to end. And if you folks have other questions that you have about this stuff, by all means, let us know, because we're always trying to convert the knowledge into useful practices, right? Because the technology is really cool, and I really could spend all day talking about it. But at the end of the day, it has to convert into something useful. So that's going to do it for this week. We will talk to you all next time. Thanks for watching today. Be sure to subscribe to our show wherever you're watching it. For more resources and to learn more, check out the Trust Insights podcast at trustinsights.ai/TI podcast and a weekly email newsletter at trustinsights.ai/newsletter. Got questions about what you saw in today's episode? Join our free Analytics for Marketers Slack group at trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers. See you next time.